Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Stamos. I'm the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory. And along with my co-editors, Shelby Grossman and Jeff Hancock, I want to welcome you to the kickoff of the first edition of the Journal of Online Trust and Safety. We're really excited to be talking to you about the journal today and to bring you the authors of the actual papers themselves. So what is the Journal of Online Trust and Safety? Aren't there enough academic journals? You're asking yourself, don't you have enough to read? Well, our goal between Shelby, Jeff, and I, and those many people on our editorial board who have been advising us with this new journal is to create kind of a new cross-disciplinary output that is focused on the abuse of online platforms and the things that those companies can do to both understand and then to mitigate those harms. I think we've all been paying attention to the news these days. While we kicked off the journal quite a while ago, I think our timing has been reasonably good on the first volume, in that we are following up on the leak of thousands and thousands of pages of documents from inside the integrity teams at Facebook, integrity being the term used for trust and safety work inside of Facebook. And the interest that people have shown in these documents, both in the journalistic capacity, but also the academics clamoring to see the raw research, I think has demonstrated both the need for this kind of work to happen inside of companies, but also the need for those companies to be open and transparent about what they're doing. And for the ability for academics to do the same kind of research on the same data the companies have, and to be able to coordinate research across different disciplines and across different platforms. And so this solving the problems that are inherent in what we see right now, which is a chaotic release of thousands of pages of research ranging from quantitative social science to investigative research, that is just kind of creating lots of headlines, but not a lot of understanding. Changing that formula is exactly why we wanted to create this journal. A couple of things about the journal. It is cross-disciplinary. So you will see people from the social scientists, you'll see computer scientists, you'll see people from the legal and policy fields. Our goal is to have all kinds of different fields represented. And so one of the challenges that we'll talk about here is trying to balance out and to make sure we have all of those different areas representing that the quality of the scholarship is equivalent to the scholarship that you would see in journals that represent those specific fields, yet that they're focused on this one area, the abuse of online platforms. We want to spur new research, though. There have been lots of people doing great work over the last decade, but sometimes they find it difficult to fit their output into the existing outlets. And so by doing this, we're hoping that they will be more creative and more open about the kind of research they can do so that they don't have to make it fit into the somewhat tough strictures of their existing journals that existed in each of their fields. We're trying to make this journal very relevant to real time. Anybody in academia will bemoan the fact that sometimes it takes years and years from the time they have finished their first draft until they see their output out in a journal. Clearly, reading about what was going on an online platform 18 months ago is not going to be relevant to anybody doing this work inside the companies or out. Our goal is to have real impact on academic research, on policy, and on the behavior of companies. And to have that impact, we have to move very quickly. And so we're doing a quick peer review process. We're not getting rid of any of the rigor, but we are trying to line up the peer review as quickly as possible. We're also using a letter of intent system to allow people to send us a letter of intent that describes their document, to describe their research, and that will allow our editorial team to do desk rejects at a very high rate, and to perhaps make things smoother for researchers who don't have to go round after round after round of making reviewer number 2 happy with their manuscript before they find out whether they're going to be published or not. This journal is open source. It is available freely online. We think it is incredibly important for everybody, including people that do not have magical login access via their university library, to be able to see this content. It is open to the public. It is open to policymakers. It is open to people who are working at companies big and small. This journal will always be open access. We will never charge money to see the output. Our goal is to spread this information as far and wide as possible. We are also looking, as you can see here, to have some alternative outlets for you to experience this content. Living in a online connected world like this, one of the benefits we want to use is the ability for you to hear directly from the authors of the journals instead of just reading the summaries other people have written, that you get to hear straight in their voice about what their research was, what kind of impact they think it might have, and ask them questions. So for every issue, we will be doing a conversation like this, a webinar with the authors. All of the authors will be invited. They're not required to come, but they will be invited to come answer questions and so people can hear in their own voice. And the journal is both cross-disciplinary. It also has a variety of different kinds of content. You will see in our first issue that we have peer-reviewed content, and we also have non-peer-reviewed content such as commentary. So we are looking for non-empirical work of opinion work, summary work that is not going to be peer reviewed. We will still be interested in publishing that. And you'll see that the majority of our output of our issues will be peer reviewed, but we'll continue to have that alternative outlet. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shelby, but first I want to really thank her. Shelby has been the absolute driver behind this. Dr. Grossman joined our team a couple of years ago and has been incredibly important in the Stanford Internet Observatory, and I've been really proud to work with her on this project. Why don't you take it away, Shelby?
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So 4 quick logistical things, then we're just going to dive right into the interviews. So first, there's not going to be a Q&A at the end, just for time reasons, but feel free to put questions into the chat and the authors will answer them. Thanks. I just wanted to say thanks to I just want to say thanks to a couple of people. So first, massive thanks to David Teal, who has put dozens of hours into this first issue. Thanks also to Elena Christ, Justin Casimir Braun, Matt DeButz, to Alex, to Jeff Hancock, who, as Alex mentioned, is the co-editor of the journal and a professor of communication at Stanford. Thanks to our editorial board, and thanks to Eden Beck, who is our amazing copy editor. Third, I just want to note that one of these papers is going to be on self-harm. So if you prefer not to think about that topic, you should skip the presentation from Anna Van Meter in about 30 minutes. And then finally, all of the articles can be found at tsjournal.org. So TS stands for Trust Safety, so tsjournal.org. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to alternate with Jeff in interviewing people, and over the next hour, you will hear from 7 different authors. So to start off, we're going to start with Nate Persily, who is a law professor at Stanford. So Nate, in your kind of commentary for this first issue, you introduce a proposal for researcher access to platform data and include a revised version of your proposed legislation, the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act. And so while I think many people would agree that more data sharing between platforms and researchers is a good thing, you note that not only do the details matter, they are the only thing that matters. So I was wondering if you could talk about what details matter and how you're thinking about those details.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you and the Internet Observatory. What you pulled off here is truly remarkable. And so, folks out there, the academics out there know how hard it is to start a new journal, and how quickly you all did this was really incredible. And I think it's going to make a huge splash. On this legislation and the explanation that appears in the journal, and which I submitted to Congress yesterday, which was perfectly fortuitous in the publication schedule. I've been working for the last 5 years on trying to get Facebook to open up its data to outside research. We have continuously been banging our heads against the wall with respect to privacy issues. I became convinced over that period that we need federal legislation in order to force the platforms to open up to outside research. When I say that the details matter, I specifically mean on how researchers are going to get access to the data, the role of government, universities, researchers, and the platforms in that kind of relationship, and then most importantly, how we keep user data private. And so the legislation attempts to try to develop a very secure, privacy-protected pathway overseen by the FTC, but not where the firms are turning over data to the government, but rather they will keep the data, but they will be forced to share it with outside researchers. This is not a substitute for a more general data sharing or transparency obligation, which would, put more disclosed data on the web and for journalists and others. But it's something that solves the problem that I've been living with for the last 5 years, which is, can we get some outside voices, some outside researchers to look at the same data that the companies have? And so that's the goal of this legislation.
Awesome. And so your legislation also has provisions related to academics scraping data. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that particular proposal looks like and why you think it's important.
So, as is well known to many people, a group of researchers at NYU were kicked off of the Facebook platform because they were scraping ads to try to figure out whether the political ad category at Facebook and the measures that they were taking to identify political ads was actually capturing the universe of political ads. And so they found a lot of stuff that was slipping through. And because that violated the terms of service of Facebook with respect to scraping, their accounts were disabled. What the legislation does is it protects researchers like that, and frankly, anybody should probably have this protection if they're doing public interested research, but this again focuses on academics. It says that you cannot be criminally prosecuted for scraping publicly available data, and you cannot be civilly liable. You can't be essentially sued into bankruptcy by these companies. They can still turn off your access, and I think we need to protect that right of the companies. But there was a very famous case with Aaron Swartz, who unfortunately tragically committed suicide after scraping JSTOR because he was worried about being prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. There's a lot of case law that's happened since then, most notably the Van Buren decision, but no researcher should have to worry that they are going to, be forced to pay millions of dollars or potentially be thrown in jail because they are scraping publicly available data. And that's what the legislation tries to protect.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nate. Okay, so we're going to move on to Jaehyun Kim, soon to be an assistant professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. So Jaehyun, in your paper, which is co-authored with Aniket Kasari, you're looking at the nexus of hate speech and misinformation, and you're trying to assess how former US President Donald Trump's anti-Asian tweets shaped both anti-Asian hate speech and also counter hate speech. So I was wondering, to start, if you could talk a little bit about how you went about studying the effect of Trump's tweets on anti-Asian hate speech and counter hate speech, and what you found.
Yeah, for sure. So let me first give you a little background. So on March 16, 2020, Donald Trump, then president of the United States, framed coronavirus as the Chinese virus for the first time. We found that Trump's tweet made the term Chinese virus trendier on the Twitter platform, and also changed the context in which Twitter users use this particular term. So before Trump's speech, primarily anti-Asian hate speakers used the term Chinese virus, especially when they criticized the liberal media, such as MSNBC or CNN or the Chinese government. After the inflammatory speech, both anti-Asian hate speaker and counter hate speaker used the term Chinese virus because it became part of the everyday political conversation around COVID-19 and Asian Americans.
So interesting. And so you find this relationship. I think what I find really interesting about this paper is you're not just looking at the relationship between Trump's tweets on hate speech. You're looking at the relationship between hate speech and also misinformation. So you find that Trump's anti-Asian tweets, there's a relationship between Trump's anti-Asian tweets and COVID-19 misinformation. So I was wondering if you could talk about, what exactly you found there and just why theoretically you might think there would be a relationship between hate speech and misinformation.
Yes, actually, that's one thing we didn't expect to find from the paper, but we got it. So one of the striking findings for us was the extent to which anti-Asian hate speech was closely associated with conspiracy theories surrounding the origin of COVID-19. So counter hate speech speaker constantly called out anti-Asian hate speech as being racist and xenophobic. So in response, instead of invoking racial slur, hate speech speaker invoked facially neutral language with a reasonable sounding rationale. So for instance, there was one hate speech speaker who was well aware that the term Chinese virus is racially charged. Nonetheless, they insisted on using it because they believe that dissociating China from the virus is the goal of the Chinese government's propaganda. So we often think the hate speech and misinformation are kind of separate problem, but I think there's a kind of possibility that there could be some interesting connection between two, because users may be incentivized to justify hate speech using misinformation to avoid being labeled as biased.
Thanks, Jan. Jeff, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Shelby. And by thanks, Shelby, I should say, like Alex, I mean, really, thank you, Shelby, as being the driving force making this whole journal take place. So just want to recognize that and say thanks again. I'm really excited to be part of it. Next up, we have Josh Tucker, professor of politics at NYU. Josh, your paper was co-authored with William Godel, Zev Sanderson, Kevin Aslett, Jonathan Nagler, Richard Bono, and our very own Nate, all the folks. And I'm really excited about this paper being in the first issue along with all the others. They really represent the diversity that we were shooting for. Here, you use a social science approach to assess experimentally the ability of ordinary people to fact check news and compare that to professional fact checkers. I think this is important not only for people like me that are doing work related to disinformation and understanding that. So we need these as stimuli in our studies, but also for companies and journalists, anybody interested in disinformation. So thanks for doing all this great work. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went answering the question of how ordinary folks can establish fact checks versus professionals?
Yes, thanks so much, Jeff. I want to join everybody at echoing thanking Shelby for all the incredible work she's done on this, and Alex for getting it off the ground, and Jeff for all of his work as well. Yeah, so our paper was motivated by the question of whether or not we can crowdsource the fact checking of news. And obviously there's sort of we were really excited to be part of this journal because there are sort of great social science theory questions in here, but huge pragmatic questions as well. And we were motivated to do this by the fact that the platforms were talking about doing this. And it's easy to understand why the idea of crowdsourcing fact checking of news is really pleasing to the platforms and actually should be a sort of normatively pleasing idea to a lot of people, right? Like normatively, it solves this huge conundrum we're in. Anytime we want to act on whether news is true or not, we have the question of who gets to be the decider, who chooses whether the news is true or not. And there's a fear of, having the state choose what news is true or not is problematic, but having huge, large, powerful corporations choosing what news is true or not is problematic. So this would get us out of this because we could say, all right, look, we're going to take it out of the hands of the platforms and we're going to let, as the platforms have described it, our user base do it. Or we could even go more social scientifically. We're going to let a random sample of the population do this. Secondly, it offers the hope for scaling. And scaling is if you could actually go to random people, pay them a little bit of money, have them make assessments of news, and that could be something that you could feed into your system to decide what's false and what's not false. You could scale this. And you could scale it across time, even in countries like the United States where there are developed fact checker markets, but they get overwhelmed at particular moments in time. And even more excitingly, you could potentially scale it to countries in the world that don't have professional fact checking infrastructures. So in order to do this, to try to see if this was feasible and get the assessment of whether or not you could crowdsource the fact checking of news, we built a pipeline to select articles and to get them crowd checked by ordinary people and to get them checked by professional fact checkers. The goals that we had in building this pipeline were threefold. We wanted to make sure that the pipeline did the following. First, we wanted to get real-time news stories. We have lots of research that shows most people encounter news right after it's first published. Most of the academic research that's been done on people's ability to assess the veracity of news has to do with news that's either fake news that's created by the researchers themselves for the purpose of the study, or it's news that's quite old. So we wanted to get real-time news. The second thing was we wanted to get researchers out of the decision of choosing the articles because we wanted to avoid the biases researchers might bring to having particularly salacious stories or stories that they would think might be, even for subconscious reasons would be valuable in the research. So we wanted to have a pre-registered algorithm that would make the decision about what articles to choose to be part of the study. And the final thing is we wanted lots and lots of people. So we weren't relying on small numbers of folks here to do this, but also so we could build and randomly build lots of different crowds. So what we did was we built a pipeline where we had 5 different streams that we set up, 2 from mainstream news sources, left-leaning and right-leaning, and 3 from suspect news sources that had been identified by other scholars and journalists. And we broke those down into left-leaning, right-leaning, and ones we couldn't even tell whether they were left-leaning or right-leaning. And then every morning of the study, we would grab a news article, the most popular news article that had appeared in the past 24 hours. So not only were we getting us, the academics, out of the business of choosing the articles, we were letting the people choose the articles. These were the things that had been most read of the new articles that had appeared in the past 24 hours. And we would then send those out simultaneously to professional fact checkers and to our crowds. And we got different crowds every day, and we did this over many months. So what we ended up doing was using our professional fact checkers to give us our ground truth. And then we could use our individual assessments, what we had from all these people, to construct crowds and to see if these crowds could match what the professional fact checkers had come up with. Now, there are loads of different ways. Crowdsourcing fact checking, again, it's this normatively pleasing idea, but how you actually aggregate from the crowds to the decision making is a huge question. And we spend a lot of time on this in our paper, but we essentially break this down into two big picture questions. One is, do you use simple, easy to explain rules, which is sort of normatively the most pleasing way to say, look, we're going to go to 5 people, we're going to take the mode of those 5 people, whatever they agree upon is the mode of the people. Or do you use machine learning, which arguably can pick up on much more signals, many more signals in the data, but is much more of a black box and much harder to explain to the public? And then second, do you just take a random draw of the people who are your population, whether it's Facebook users or just US citizens or Tanzanian citizens? Or do you try to take a specialized crowd, a crowd that you think might be better at getting the answers to these correct? So in the paper, that's what we do. We use the same data that we corrected. We do all sorts of different decision-making rules to try to figure out what the crowds were able to do. And we break this down into sort of 4 basic categories: simple rules with either random crowds or specialized users, and then machine learning models with random crowds or specialized users. And we use a variety of different rules, and we use a variety of different machine learning models. So here are the key takeaways, though, that I can tell you. The number one thing we learned from this is no matter what we did, and we did these in very specialized circumstances, no matter what we did, crowds are not as good as adding one more professional fact checker and matching what the professional fact checkers come up with. The really bad news is that the most normatively pleasing crowd, the crowd of random users using a simple decision-making rule, performs the worst of anything. It does almost as bad a job as simply guessing the mean. All right, so we're getting almost no additional purchase off of this. In general, we found, again, not normatively great, the machine learning models, perhaps not surprising in retrospect, outperform the simple rules. And we also found that the specialized crowds outperform the random crowds. So you can basically get more signal out of crowds by abandoning the more normatively pleasing roles by moving from random to specialized and moving from simple rules to machine learning. So overall, our takeaway from this is that it's a big red flag to be warning when you see platforms talking about moving to crowdsourcing models. There is, and the good news, though, that I want to say here is that I think we really do feel after what we did, and we did this we had much less data than platforms could had. We were doing this on our own as outside academics, and even we could get useful information. There is signal that can be extracted from here. So I think our takeaway is that to be cautious about rushing to sort of very simple rules. We're just going to let upvotes and downvotes, and this is going to be built into our fact-checking mechanism. But that there is some potential here for crowds to be a piece of a pipeline as we continue to wrestle with this question of what we do with the release of false information into the news ecosystem and the possibility of social media platforms to spread this virally and in incredibly fast time.
Thanks, Josh. Really appreciate that overview. I was struck also by the sadness, of the normative approach that we'd be really excited about. And it reminded me of 2 sort of very different cases where we rely on crowds and they do well. One is, you get a crowd of people to guess how many beans are in a jar, how many cows are in a field, and you take the mean, they do well. The other is a jury system in the legal environment where we, empower 12 regular folks to make a decision, which could be life-changing for that person. Why do you think on both sides, one's, really deep and slow and the other's fast and quick? Why do you think the fact checkers here, the sort of like the best solution, which is the crowd, don't live up to either of those aspects or those kind of contexts?
Well, I won't comment on whether juries make right decisions on average over not. I think that's probably an interesting question as well. But I do think, as a social scientist, I think that the impetus here is on us. When we get a new toy to play with, we want to interrogate the scope conditions under which that toy works. And I think that's the biggest takeaway to sort of come from this, is just because normatively it's pleasing and we can look at the cow example and think this might work, it doesn't mean it's going to work. Now, I have a couple thoughts on this, right? One thing is the cow doesn't care if the crowd gets its weight right. right? So it's not an antagonistic situation, unless it's a very self-conscious cow, right? But it's not an antagonistic situation. And when you're dealing with fact checking, these are antagonistic situations. I mean, whatever you think the purpose of the people who are putting out this information, what they don't want is it to be easily identified and removed, right, from social media platforms, right? Like regardless of whether it's political or economic and reasons for that. So I think that's one thing. We have to think more carefully when these are potentially adversarial situations about this. And the other thing to compare to a jury is, to be very clear, the way we ran this study is that we just sent people articles. We asked them, there was a bunch of other things going on. We ran up, which we have many other papers on with all sorts of experimental manipulations to see if we can make this better. But in this case, what we're dealing with here is, in all of these cases, we were trying to test, because of the scaling question, of whether or not you could quickly send things out to a crowd and not be too demanding of their time. That is essentially the opposite of a jury. The jury says, we're going to be very demanding of your time, tell you the stakes are incredibly high, and count on the self mechanisms because you think it's important to kick in this case. Ours was really to see if it was scalable at a level where we put very little demands on people. So there are other models out there, right? Like Nick Adams' Public Editor, where you try to appeal to people's motivation to try to improve the information ecosystem, and you ask them to really devote some time to this. We did not assess that kind of a model, and it may be that those models end up actually working much better, but then there's the question of scaling. So I think the bottom line is we need more research about these things, and we have to be very careful about assuming things will hold.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And a juror is civically, sort of required to be there, right? There's this civic commitment that we've all made to be part of that. And as we think about the regulation that Nate and others are proposing, there could be these new kinds of ways of thinking about getting people involved civically. So that's great. Thanks so much. Next up, we have Anna Van Meter, assistant professor at the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research, with her co-authors Olive Borge, Victoria Cosgrove, Alina Christ, Shelby Grossman, and Shelby Perkins. And for those of you out there, as Shelby mentioned, this is a paper about self-harm. So if that is something you're concerned about, now would be okay time to mute. And thanks so much for joining us. Really pleased to have your paper as part of this, just to highlight, the diversity once again. We just had social science paper, we had a Twitter analysis, we've had a legal document here. So it's just fantastic. And this work is really important. I think audits are going to be increasingly important as we move forward, especially when we see the results of the Facebook files. In your paper, you ran an audit study of Google, Bing, and DuckDuckGo, assessing what results these search engines service in response to suicide queries. Could you just let us know an overview of the key findings?
Sure. So just to give a little bit more context for the audit that we did, we were interested in looking at 3 different platforms. Google is the most used search engine. Bing is embedded in Microsoft products, so it's also commonly used. And then DuckDuckGo, because it's seen as a more private way of searching, and we thought that people who were interested in searching suicide-related content might go to DuckDuckGo because of its privacy offerings. And we did a few different types of searches to see what results these different search engines would provide. First, we started with sort of general face valid searches. So searching terms like suicide or kill myself, things that we thought that these search engines might sort of put into their algorithms to be identified easily as problematic types of searches. And then based on some other research, we also used some more specific types of searches that had actually been found in the Google search archives of people who were hospitalized because of suicidal ideation or suicidal behavior. So these search terms tended to be more related to means, so different methods that people might be interested in as ways to attempt suicide. And then we were also interested in how these search engines performed in different languages. So we did the searches both in English and in Spanish as the second most common language in the United States. So when we did the searches, we coded a few different types of results that were provided. So first, we were interested in whether or not there was a help message. So many platforms have a policy that if there are suicide-related searches, that they're going to put the National Suicide Prevention Line hotline number at the top. So we were looking to see whether that in fact was happening. Then we were looking at the actual URLs that the search provided. And then we were also interested to see whether there were advertisements or suggested searches that might also be related to suicide. And we coded the content in a number of different ways, but I think for the purposes today, we were interested in whether there was problematic content. So anything that was promoting suicide in any way or, providing people with instructions, things like that, in any of the different types of content that we were looking at. So in terms of our results, we found that of the 3 platforms, Google was the least likely to return any type of pro-suicide or otherwise problematic content. Fewer than 10% of their results had that type of content, where it was about twice that with Bing and DuckDuckGo. Interestingly, though, when we looked at the specific type of query, if it was a more means-related or specific type of query, it was more likely to return problematic content than for the more general kind of face-valid queries. We also found that only about half of the searches resulted in a help message being provided. And that, again, those more specific means-related queries were less likely to lead to a help message than the other more general types of queries. Another thing that was sort of interesting was that the Spanish language searches were less likely to lead to problematic suicide content, but they were also less likely to get a help message. And we think that, probably rather than the algorithm doing a better job of filtering out suicide-related content when it's in Spanish, it's probably that there's just less problematic content out there in Spanish, on Spanish websites.
Great, thanks, Anna. I really appreciate that overview. Can you tell us, why do you think it matters what the search engines surface? People are coming in, they're seeing the search engine, and you get this list of results. Why does it matter what the search engines are returning on this?
Well, we know from other research that people who are at risk for suicide, who might be contemplating suicide, do go online and perform these types of searches, but that perhaps counterintuitively, when there is help-related content provided, that they're actually more likely to look at that than they are at the sort of problematic suicide-related content. So providing that as an option to people is really important. Another thing is that there's something called suicide contagion, which people may or may not be familiar with, but basically the idea is that when there is a publicized suicide or a suicide in somebody's community, somebody that they're familiar with, that oftentimes that leads to other suicides. And there are sort of media rules about how suicide should be handled to try to prevent this contagion effect. And one of the things that we found was that most of the problematic content that was being returned was either in social media or like blog type posts. So this is the type of content that might come from people who are part of someone's online community. So it might have this element of familiarity that's more likely to lead to a suicide contagion. So if people are seeing chat rooms and other things like that promoting this type of content, it might be particularly likely to lead to someone doing something to harm themselves.
Thank you, Anna. Appreciate it. Over to you, Shelby.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, and a reminder that all these articles are up at tsjournal.org, which I'll throw in the chat again in a minute. So next up, we have Camille Francois, who is a doctoral candidate at the French Institute of Geopolitics at University Paris 8, and also a lecturer at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. So Camille, in your paper, which is with Evelyn Dueck and is called The Accidental Origins, Underappreciated Limits, and Enduring Promises of Transparency Reporting about Information Operations. So in this paper, one of the things you talk about is you argue that the 2016 Internet Research Agency disclosures were a pivotal moment in content moderation. So I was wondering if you could talk more about why that moment was so pivotal.
Of course, thank you, Shelby. And sorry that our title is a bit of a mouthful. So we do talk about what happened in 2016, and that's a time where the Internet Research Agency's campaign to target the 2016 presidential election gets detected. And at this time, it really is a blind spot for platforms. They don't have specific policies to address that. They don't have specific staff in place who are supposed to proactively detect it. And so there are these extraordinary circumstances around this moment, because we have, on the one hand, internal security staff who are saying, let's actually address this issue with transparency, let's communicate about what we're finding. We have huge congressional pressure by the public, pressure by the Senate, who's saying, like, no, you need really to go the extra mile and be more transparent on what you're saying. And you have a type of data specifically that is fake accounts. And so that actually enables the sharing of this data, which again, then is primarily fake accounts, in a way that you have this unique case of a national security crisis, which results in an extraordinary pocket of transparency, which, as you know, doesn't happen so often in platform policy. So we document this moment, but I think afterwards what's really fascinating is this exceptional moment sticks around, and the transparency regimes that are inherited from 2017 continue and expand to cover information operations.
Super interesting. So, I mean, you kind of already alluded to this, but maybe you can expand a bit more on, why you think the kind of transparency reporting that we've seen from platforms around influence operations, like why that kind of transparency reporting has not extended to other closely related content moderation categories.
Yeah, and before we get there, I think the other thing that we do in this paper is, all these transparency reporting, they share this common point of origin, right? They flow back from the IRA disclosures in 2017, but then they evolve in actually fairly different definitions and regime. And so if you, look like 3 years, 4 years down the road, the definition of IO that Google has, that Facebook has, that Twitter have, that Reddit has, they're all meaningfully different from one another, and they're actually ending up reporting on different things. And the question becomes the one that you asked, right? Like, what does it mean for us to have this sort of small pocket of transparency with very ambiguous boundaries, right? Like there's no agreement on the definition of IO. And the other side of this pocket is what Evelyn and I call the transparency cliff. And we explore this sort of closest cousins, right? So categories of content moderation that can be very close to information operation. A good example here is spam, right? Some of these sophisticated information operation campaigns could also be classified as spam, not only because those definitions are ambiguous, but then what happens is if they do get classified as spam, you have no transparency on that campaign, right? There's actually no meaningful sort of in-depth transparency. You end up sort of vaguely hearing about aggregate numbers. And so we talk about what it means to have such a cliff between the small pocket of IO transparency and all the closest cousins around it, what this means for incentives, not just for platforms, but also for researchers, for governments, and more importantly, how it distorts our own understanding as the public and as researchers of the contour of this disinformation problem.
Super interesting. Thanks, Camille. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Shelby. We now turn to Hani Farid, professor in electrical engineering and computer sciences at Berkeley. Hani, welcome, and thank you for being part of our inaugural issue. You provide an overview of perceptual hashing and how it works and how it can be used to deal with problematic content, especially images. And I have to say, as a non-computer scientist, I found this article really helpful for understanding that whole process and getting a deeper understanding of the techniques involved and what it is. So could you provide us with an overview of what this is and the context that it can be applied in?
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here, and thanks to you and Shelby and Alex and the rest of the team for launching the journal. I think it's, I think this question of, well, do we need another academic journal? I would phrase it as, what took so long? I think this is a really important step to bring the academic community together and in the private industry together. So I'm thrilled to be part of this. Perceptual hashing, also known as robust hashing, sometimes just hashing, is a technique to help online services deal with problematic content, from legal adult pornography to copyright infringement to child sexual abuse material to terror-related material to you name it, typically in the form of audio, image, and video. And the basic idea is quite straightforward, which is that what we know about the internet is problematic content is rarely one-off. It tends to recirculate. So for example, in the space of child sexual abuse, images and videos from years ago, decades ago, continually redistribute, continually re-victimizing young children that are depicted in the imagery. And the goal of perceptual or robust hashing is to say, let's stop the redistribution of material once it has been identified either manually or with some other technique. So for example, for copyright infringement, the John Oliver show can say, hey, we don't want these specific videos to circulate on YouTube, or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children could say, we don't want these specific images or videos because they depict children to be distributed. And you reach into that content, whether it's an audio or image or video, and you extract a distinct digital signature. And that signature has some important properties. One is that it is distinct. So if I give you two images that are different, the signature should be different. It's resilient, hence the term robust or perceptual. That is, if the image or video undergoes an alteration, the signature should stay relatively stable. Very easy to extract and efficient to extract, and easy to compare against a database of known harmful content, whether it's child abuse material or copyright infringement. And basically every single image or video or audio that is uploaded to a YouTube or a Facebook or whatever, you extract that same signature, you compare it to a database of known harmful content, and you can filter very quickly and very, very accurately at the time of upload. And there's a couple things that are attractive about this technology. One is it's very similar to the type of technology we use for viruses and malware. The way we stop the redistribution once a virus is detected or malware is detected is we extract a signature from that harmful bit of code, and then we stop the redistribution in the future. Highly, highly accurate. False alarm rates for perceptual hashing are in the tens to hundreds of billions. You may have heard of photo DNA. That is a version of perceptual hashing. You may have heard of Apple's neural hash. That's a form of perceptual hashing. And what's very nice about it is it's highly targeted, highly specific. It is explainable. We can tell you what it's doing. We can tell you what we're searching for. The drawback is it doesn't help you with the zeroth iteration of harmful content. So it will not in and of itself identify a child being sexually abused for the first time on a live video chat, but it can stop the redistribution. And so what I do in this paper is I talk about the history of the technology. I talk about the underlying methods that go into it for a non-technical audience. I talk about real-world implementations from photo DNA to neural hash to content ID on YouTube. And then more importantly, also talk about its strengths and its limitations. I would argue that some form of perceptual hashing is needed for any baseline content moderation, but it in and of itself does not solve all of your content moderation needs. I think it's just one tool in that larger toolbox of dealing with technological solutions to content moderation.
Thanks so much, Annie. That's a great overview. To that point, can you just tell us a little bit more about some of the limitations you see using this technology? So we have a lot of practitioners online right now and maybe considering how to use this. What are some of the things, like for instance, is the speed at which content is being uploaded? Is that a challenge, or what are some of the core limitations?
Good. So interestingly, scale and speed is not a problem with perceptual hashing. It operates by design. The algorithms that extract the signatures are extremely fast, sub-millisecond. Comparison to database can be done extremely efficiently, so the databases can scale into the millions. So runtime complexity is not the problem, which is good news, because often that is the biggest problem with content moderation. The limitations are, I would argue, twofold. One is it only helps you with things that have been previously identified. And so it's not going to help you with the live video that is being streamed from Christchurch, for example, but it can help you with the re-uploads of that video after the fact. The other limitation, and this is probably true in most spaces, is that it's inherently adversarial. You have to understand that this world that we live in is we are an inherently an adversarial system. So every time we develop technology, there's an adversary trying to get around it. Spam, viruses, malware, ransomware, it's the same thing. And so the technology, there are ways of circumventing it. I know how to circumvent it. I'm not going to tell you, but I know how to do it. And so you're always sort of having to refine these algorithms and update them and deal with the counterattacks, because it's an ever-evolving adversarial landscape. On the plus side, it's efficient, it's highly accurate, it's been deployed for over a decade now, and it really is what I would call sort of like the first level of defenses, whether you're a Facebook or a medium-sized company or even a small company. These are relatively easy to implement. PhotoDNA, for example, can be licensed for free from the National Center. There are other open source implementations of perceptual hashing that can be licensed for free, and they're relatively easy to get up and running. And then your job, of course, at the back end is to deal with the database, what goes in there, make sure you're careful about what you put in the database, make sure that we've been talking about transparency, that there should be accountability and transparency to make sure that you are not filtering on things that you shouldn't be filtering on.
Thanks, Henry. Thank you. One of the things we want this journal to be is to be a meeting ground for academics that are doing technical work, computer scientists like yourself, with non-technical folks like social scientists such as me, where we can put them into the same place so each side can see it and understand what the other group is doing. Your article is a great example of this. And I was wondering if you have any high-level principles, tips, or suggestions for the other folks out there listening in on how to write this kind of paper that takes something that's obviously quite deeply technical and sophisticated to a more general audience that can understand it and see why it's important, what its limitations and advantages are.
I mean, that's a great question. And I'm a computer scientist and applied mathematician by training, but I'm also a teacher. And one of the things that I do, and I particularly like teaching intro courses, because my job is to take, sometimes fairly complex ideas and try to boil them down to their essence so that they can be explainable. And I think this is something that some scientists are good at, but a lot of scientists are not. I think we tend to get caught up in being excited about the nitty-gritty details and the equations. But what I love about this space, and having worked in this space for over a decade, is the impact that we can make. And a big part of that impact is not just developing technology, but explaining technology, explaining it to our representatives on Capitol Hill and in Brussels in the UK, explaining it to journalists, explaining it to social scientists, explaining it to the C-suite. And we have to work at it. I mean, it's really it's like exercising a muscle. And we have to get out of our own little heads of being excited about the equations. One of the rules that I have for when I write these types of papers is no equations. And just that, by the way, forcing yourself to think about things without falling back on the highly technical things, I think is a good exercise. But honestly, we just have to get out there and talk to people. And I can't tell you that I would argue that the most important things I've ever written have been op-eds and that have gotten wide distribution as opposed to technical papers. If you really want to make an impact, write an op-ed and make it accessible to everybody. That's what's going to have an impact on changing the way people think. They'll go read your technical paper after that, but to get in, you got to get into the op-ed.
Right on, thanks. I appreciate it. I think that advice is really good, to think about an audience that's bigger than your crew, but like folks at Congress, the people in the C-suite, and people in other disciplines. I love that, and that's inspiring. And I hope we can promote more of that here at this journal. Thanks again, Shelby. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff and Hani. So last up, we have an exceptionally timely contribution from Britton Heller, who is a human rights attorney at Foley Hoag LLP. So, Britton, in your commentary for this first issue, which is with Avi Bar-Zeev, you talk about the future of advertising in virtual reality. So, what would this look like?
Well, thank you very much for having Avi and I here today. We really couldn't have timed this one better, huh? So, if you watch sports, you've already experienced a form of augmented reality. The billboards behind the players are, if you watch them at home, are actually going to be different from the billboards in the stadium if your family or friends are there. It's the same technology that they use to put first down lines on the playing field during football broadcasts, but it's so good that they replace the players right in front of it. And so most people don't realize that the type of immersive advertising that Avi and I are concerned about is already present. In our commentary, we talk about what immersive advertising looks like, and we trace its evolution through techniques used in film, sports, and gaming. My favorite one was Coca-Cola sponsored a game called Pepsi Invaders back in the 1980s, and like Space Invaders, it had that same game mechanic, but the enemy robots spelled out Pepsi. So ads in virtual worlds are fundamentally different than ads in social media. In short, this isn't like product placement, but placement within the product. These ads are experiential, meaning that people seek them out. They even pay for them. And advertisers know that immersive content is the most persuasive form of advertising they can purchase. The way this looks is you can buy a real Gucci avatar for, a real Gucci jacket for your digital avatar. Mark Zuckerberg talked about this possibility yesterday. They're very, very persuasive. Like there are all these experiences from the Jurassic Park franchise, and some you play with friends, and some you play alone, and some use bespoke VR hardware. But what better way to market Jurassic Park than to put you actually inside it? We have the capability to right now have the people that look like your friends and family recommend things to you, or to use eye tracking to track what people look at in augmented reality and recommend that they purchase it.
So fascinating. So what are some of the risks that you foresee in virtual reality advertising?
The main risk, if we wanted to kind of summarize it, is the leveraging of personal or sensitive information about a user's body, mind, preferences, and behavior in ways that are difficult for users to consent to or even understand, and thus defend against. We also found several social issues that related to advertising in VR. One is the impact on the creator economy. In the Meta announcement yesterday, they talked about content creator marketplaces like Spark AR that are forthcoming, and building digital economies around the AR VR space. But Avi and I were a little concerned that this would replicate the harms of the gig economy in a new digital space. Meta talked about moving away from using a Facebook login, but that doesn't solve the privacy and transparency problems that we've already observed. How will sponsored content be identified? What information will be cabined off from being used in targeted advertising in AR, VR? And how will data that's already been collected be applied? The emphasis on safety that we saw from executives in the announcement yesterday gave no clarity to how content moderation is going to work in a spatial computing-based environment. There are no assurances that the company will actually make the proper investments to escape the critiques that have been levied against Facebook's social media. And there's also no clarity in how existing laws like the FTC Truth in Advertising standards will be applied to digital humans and virtual influencers. Finally, because of the way that AR/VR works and the attractiveness and pervasive quality of experiential ads, we want a separate tailored terms of service for these XR environments. It should be based on research, not just importing the standards from social media across computing platforms. For example, if you are stabbed with a cartoon knife in a VR environment, your brain interprets the act of violence just like you were being stabbed with a photorealistic knife, just like you were being stabbed in the real world. You respond to the act of violence because, like Mark Zuckerberg pointed out, with the presence and immediacy aspects of AR/VR, it feels like you're really there. And so your brain responds to it like you were really there. The fact that it's a cartoon knife and not doesn't look like a knife in the non-VR real world doesn't actually matter if you look at the neuroscience, because the gaps that you would see in a poor resolution version of a weapon are filled in by your brain and actually makes it feel more real, according to studies that people have done about treating PTSD and other related illnesses in VR AR. So overall, Avi and I argue for caution in the realm of XR ads, starting right now, because the hardware and the digital ecosystem and the metaverse are still being built, and we have a chance to not repeat the same pitfalls that we saw in social media related environments. Both of us were very pleased that the journal considered AR/VR as a pertinent realm for us to comment in, especially as Avi's been building this hardware for 30 years, and I've been making legal and social commentary on it for at least 5. So thank you very much. And we really, really appreciated the opportunity to share.
No, thanks so much, Britton, for your contribution.
Shelby, I think you're muted.
Can people hear? No, okay. Thanks so much, Britton, for your contribution. So that's all we have for today. Thanks so much to the authors of the first issue for joining. The second issue of the journal is going to come out at the end of February. And so if you'd like to submit research for that issue, the deadline is Monday for peer-reviewed submission. And the deadline, if you want to submit commentary, is December 1st. So thanks everyone for attending, and I hope everyone has a good day.